My name is Karida Brown, and I'm from Long Island, New York, originally from a little town called Uniondale, and I currently live in Los Angeles, and I'm a professor of sociology and African American studies at UCLA. My parents are both born and reared in Lynch, Kentucky, a little coal mining town, or formerly company-owned coal mining town up in the valley on the top of a mountain. My family originates from Alabama, or at least that's the origin point that we know of, before slavery. So all four of my grandparents are from Alabama. From Pritchard, a place called Bolagie, Mobile, Alabama, and Bessemer. And all four of my grandparents migrated from Alabama to Eastern Kentucky, to Lynch, Kentucky, so my granddaddies could pursue a career in coal mining. And that is what they did for their entire lives. So combined between my two grandfathers, they've served almost 80 years in the mining industry, and my grandmothers were homemakers in Lynch, Kentucky, where they raised 14 and 11 children respectively. So we can think about the Black migration into and out of Eastern Kentucky kind of in two phases. So first is how they got there. Most Black folks who were living in those coal towns, working as miners, were not born or raised there. There was a distinct migration into the region, and I'm talking about for the industry. And the majority of those men were recruited from Alabama, and that was for a very specific reason, because there were coal mines in Alabama. And in fact, Alabama is the most mineral-rich state in the Deep South, right? So there is a long tradition of coal, iron, and ore mining there. And many of the companies that were setting up shop in Harlan County owned mines in Alabama, so they knew exactly where to get the labor. They also knew that most of the Black coal mining labor in Alabama was being sourced from convict leasing. So it was very easy and attractive to lure potential laborers to migrate to Eastern Kentucky. It was an easy sell. So one thing you need to know about that is, okay, so then how do they get there? It's the early 1900s, the post-Reconstruction era. Alabama was a wretched environment in terms of just racial violence. So it wasn't just easy to get up and decide to migrate. So the companies sent labor agents to go get men to agree to migrate to Eastern Kentucky. And so, for example, in Lynch, there was this guy named Limehouse. White guy, they say that he was skinny and he used to wear a straw hat. He drove a truck that carried watermelon and sugarcane and corn, things like that, and men. And he would smuggle Black men from Alabama, sometimes in the middle of the night, and bring them to Lynch. Once they'd work off whatever agreement they had with Limehouse, Limehouse would then agree to go back and get their wives and their children. So that's how many of the early families got there. Now, of course, you had folks who hoboed, who migrated on their own volition. That was there too. But these labor agents played a tremendous role in getting a lot of the increased Black migration, specifically, and I'm talking like Harlan County coal towns, because that's what I know the best. How did Black folks get out? So if we kind of look at this on a generational arc, you had from 1910 to about 1940, the Black population in Harlan County alone goes from 2% to 10%. That is a huge population increase, right? But between 1940 and 1970, Harlan County lost 70% of its Black population. It's like, so overnight in one generation, Now you see them, now you don't. So the impetus for the mass outmigration was obvious. So the mines were starting to close down, and the mining industry was racialized like all other labor in the U.S. and around the world. So who did they lay off first? Black folks. You gotta go. This not only impacted men who were currently employed in the mines, but it was very clear that there would be no job opportunities for their children. So all adults in the community really embraced instilling in their kids from a very young age, you cannot stay here. There is no future for you here in the mines. You have to be not only prepared to leave this place, but you have to be prepared to compete in an integrated society, which is something that none of them had ever done, right? So they're setting their kids up to be these historical change agents. With that being said, at the same time, the African American Great Migration is booming, right? Black folks are moving from all over the South. And, the Deep South, they're leaving from Georgia and Alabama. What these Kentucky black folks' parents had done a generation ago, it's starting to uptick in like a huge way in the South. And so how that migration is going around the 1940s, 1950s, folks aren't stopping in layover stops that are close to where they're from. They're going straight from Bessemer to New York City, straight to DC, straight to Detroit, and that's where the jobs were at that time. Well, you go back up to the mountain where my mom and dad were growing up. Where did they go for the summers when they were on vacation? To visit those very cousins who might have been originally from Alabama, who had migrated to Cleveland, who had migrated earlier to New York, and they go visit them for the summers. What does that do? It plants a seed. When I grow up, I'm moving to New York. That's what my father did. My mom would have ended up in Cleveland, but she fell in love with my dad. So, that's how my brother and I, came to be born and raised in New York. But their migration story is very emblematic of how it kind of unfolded for many families during that generation of the out-migration, which really started around your 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So interestingly enough, like we can pretty much imagine, it's a no-brainer to imagine chain migration. If you've got cousins or aunts or uncles, sisters or brothers clustered in a particular city, it becomes a natural kind of transition for you to migrate there too, because your family will help you get set up. You can live there for a little while until you find a job. So that is the way in which the majority of folks migrated. But there were some other cool patterns that were a surprise to me. I was not expecting. And one was the integration of the military. So the integration of the United States military really served as symbolically as a opening of a new window of opportunity or possibility for the way that black men thought about what their life pathway might be. And that really created a new kind of migratory structure as well. So there in that moment you have that first generation of men who are opting into the military and joining the Navy, the Army, the Marines, and going off to fight in, I'm going to mix up my wars, but whatever. The point is that, so that then creates symbolically like this pathway of possibility. So you have the next generation of guys then saying, I'm going to the military. So it kind of snowballed in that way. And that is how many folks who ended up out west did so through the military. So funny thing, interesting tidbit that I learned from doing all these oral history interviews is that if you went to the Marine headquarters it was somewhere in like Kansas or Missouri, somewhere around here, you knew that you would be stationed out west. And then there was another base in a northeastern city, then you'd be stationed over there. So there were groups of guys who intentionally came over here because they wanted to go west. Many of those folks then end up settling down in California. So isn't that just an interesting nugget? Because I wondered, like, how did folks end up in Los Angeles or San Jose from Harlan County? Dispersed folks, but it had a very specific trajectory out west. Another kind of interesting finding was, you know, your mavericks or your loners. It was very unusual. You know, most folks came from really large families. It was not uncommon to have 10 brothers and sisters. So you always have that one who didn't follow the rest of the pack and just went someplace else and ended up in your Seattles. We have a migrant in Wyoming, right? In places that aren't necessarily go-to spots, but you wonder how those processes happen. Mass migration is gendered, so you'll find that many of your loners are women, and that's usually because they end up marrying someone who wasn't from their hometown, who, you know, went off and settled down someplace else, either closer to their family or moving for a job. So you'll find a lot of women who wound up in these cities that seem random, but it's not random at all. It's actually a pattern. It just doesn't look that way if you're just following the settlement data. So your what are now Rust Belt cities, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, those were huge, like boom cities. Then you have in the Northeast, New York, of course. To a lesser extent, there was a New Jersey faction. Later on in this particular outmigration, you start to see in the 60s, 70s moment, that's when you start seeing your San Jose, Los Angeles group growing, right? So not only are there these hotspots, right, that serve as the migratory hubs, but they are bounded in certain periods of time. Why the Rust Belt cities of the Midwest? Well, industry was booming. You could get, it was not only easy to get a really good job with your Ford Motor Companies or your other manufacturing firms. You could get a job that you could have for the rest of your life, feed your family, send your children to good schools, live a fairly middle-class life, right? So you're achieving all those ideals of the American dream. But not only that, if you were a good employee with a good reputation, you could get your nephew a job, your brother a job. So there was this way in which those cities really, it was a call and response in terms of the labor economy too. So that kind of explains that boom. New York, again, going back to that point that mass migration is gendered, there was a period in New York where there was for some reason, domestic labor was in such high demand that that white families would put ads in newspapers, black newspapers like the Chicago Defender, you know, and other local city newspapers, but then also just generally in the news, advertising, looking for help. And many black women from Eastern Kentucky and all over the country migrated to New York. If you were single, if you didn't have any kids, you could move to New York, move in with a wealthy white family, and that was a first job for many women, right? And you know, with the labor economy being gendered, and especially let's think back to what that looked like in the 60s, that was a pretty good starter job because you could live for free, save all your money, get used to the city, be in a relatively safe environment, and then move on, right? And start your own family later on. Because what I see happening if we don't do anything and if we just let nature take its course with the Eastern Kentucky Social Club, I think that we are at our last few reunions. The organization has thrived. I don't know, I don't have the data on this, but I can speculate that this is one of the longest standing African American organizations that's just solely based on social purposes, no economic driver, no scholarship, no charter like that, that has gone on for 50 years nearly. That is a huge accomplishment, but it also has a life course, and we're at the tail end of that. So that's what I see happening, if we just keep coming and going along and get along. What I hope is that folks who are in the next generation, that we, and I'm talking about you and I, William, that we continue to come, but that we step up and take leadership roles in the organization, that we bring our ideas and really invest ourselves in not only reimagining, but carrying the mantle. This organization was in large part founded because these people have such a strong sense of self and heritage and love and respect and honor for the sacrifices that their parents, grandparents, and ancestors made. And I think that is the fuel that's kept this thing going for as long as it has. Well, that's in us too. That's our story too. So it should drive us in that same way to honor them the way that they've carried us. So my hope is that we roll up our sleeves and bring the organization into the 21st century. There are all sorts of cool technological advances that we can bring to the organization, the way that we recruit folks and imagine what Eastern Kentucky is, not only geographically but metaphorically. What does it mean to be a Black person with roots in and through Appalachia, right? So the Appalachian poets have done this through their work in literary studies, but I think, what about just in practice with an organization like this? What are the possibilities? And I'm excited about that stage too. Very much still honoring what we already, the framework that we have, but reimagining it in a way that brings more souls and bodies into the space. The exhibition is titled Heart and Coal, the Soul Survivors of the Company Store. And the point of the exhibition is to really tell this story about African Americans and their contribution to the coal economy through this very particular migration story about Eastern Kentucky. But really the exhibition raises questions about racial capitalism, labor and labor history, and fromness, right? So the African American Great Migration is kind of this term that we all kind of know what it means, and it, Black people move from the South to the North and this and that, but where are we from? And really interrogating that migration story and contextualizing it within a body of history, I think is really powerful. And once you get people in a room interacting with history and memory and experiences, powerful things happen, right? So the exhibition, for me, just like on that educational level, it's threefold in those ways, but also it's a way to give back. So this organization, these people have been so good to me. They're my family, each and every one of them, and they've been so generous. I'm talking about opening up their homes, having a hot plate for me, even though I never mentioned that I was hungry. You know, thinking about me, writing me letters, always trying to be supportive and facilitative as I was conducting my research. I didn't feel like it was right to just write a book and then walk away. Not everybody wants to consume information that way. So I really thought, you know, ethically, the responsibility was on me to think of other forms of media that that I can engage people, but also thank them. Thank you for telling me your story. Your story is valuable. It's a family heirloom. It is precious, and I want you to know that I honor that. So I hope that they see the beauty in the exhibition because, as I mentioned to you before we started filming, when I started working with Tracy, the mission that I gave her for curating the exhibition, I said, I need you to read this book, and then I need you to create an exhibition that is regal. And what I mean by that is I don't want you to make it regal because I want it to be. Make it regal because that's who these people are. And when you read their stories and when you meet them and like you, oh, I'm gonna start crying, like when you get their sense of pride and love, but the way that they carry themselves and their attitude and outlook on life, they are regal. They are just glorious people, and I want that to show through in the exhibition. So I do not want to see some raggedy ass presentation of Appalachia being this sad, low down, raggedy place. Those places probably exist, I'm sure they do, but that's not where they're from, and that's not how they see themselves. And she did that, so that's Heart and Coal.